50 years ago, a small but committed group of footballers from across the VFL gathered here on the grounds of Melbourne University to start a revolution. Fed up with the system and keen to shift the balance of power away from the clubs and the league, they planned the formation of a Players Association. In the days of the second job, they were fighting for an increase in match payments, compensation from injuries, and even the right for free parking on match days. This is their story and the history of the AFLPA.
We were all like playing footy.
Footy was fun. They were just socially different times.
The club management, these are good people.
But they were mean. They were mean. They literally made me grovel. I had tears in my eyes.
We shouldn't be treated like this. Hear what we have to say.
That was something worth fighting for, and all of us believed in that.
We were doing it on the smell of an oily rag.
We actually were quite strong.
The Players Association is a very different beast.
On the league's going on, this is all the players.
Surprise, surprise, the AFL found themselves in a very difficult position.
We were in survival mode.
Sometimes these things come along, you've got to make a stand.
This is hard. It's 24/7. It's David and Goliath in many respects.
We're all trying to achieve what's fair.
There was a player who was pronounced clinically dead.
To come together like that was certainly a watershed moment.
I don't think you're going to win the public over doing that sort of thing. The public thinks you're overpaid as it is.
The AFL industry is facing its biggest financial crisis in our history.
Hubs is where this is headed.
It was mayhem. It's a really strange time to reflect on.
That was full on and there was a lot at stake.
The players always felt like we needed to fight for something. I remember Paul Marsh who said, "What do you think you're worth?"
There is still a scepticism decades later.
Oh, you're trying to get us to do things. No, we just want to talk with you and be recognised, you know.
So in 1972, Gough Whitlam was elected. It's the first time there's been a Labor government in power since 1949. That was seen as a big thing.
But the social currents were very important.
There was a fair amount of industrial action. Obviously, the pilot strike was a big one, and the tram strike brought Melbourne to a halt. I think there was a general view that people needed to get a better slice of the pie than they were getting.
Younger people wanted a more exciting life.
Degrees of freedom were within younger people's minds.
Authorised M. Young, Ainsley Avenue, Canberra, for the Australian Labor Party.
So what's the relationship between sport and the broader society? We can look at it internally in terms of what was happening within the Victorian Football League.
Footballers just weren't respected. In fact, almost disrespected.
There'd been a number of disputes at Essendon. Whoever was running Essendon at the time behaved in a dictatorial fashion.
There were probably two currents that are very important. The first current was a younger group of people came through who had been really looking at life in a different way in the 60s, and their expectations were greater. And the second current is really the fact that the club management was still in the old post-war era. They weren't really in tune with the expectations and the excitement of the time.
The then VFL wanted to become more professional. They wanted to expand.
You had a game which was in transition. You had television beginning to be significant as a source of income, and you had a need for club organisation to change. So therefore, there had to be some compromise on how you dealt with these challenges.
Well, back then, the club told you what you were going to be paid. Like, I played over 200 games and I ended up with just over 3,000 at the end of my career. The wages were pretty basic at that stage.
I had a problem living in Melbourne, playing with Geelong back in those days. How did I get to training from Melbourne when I didn't have a car? I would go from college, go down Swanson Street, down to Flinders Street Station, catch the train out to Footscray. From Footscray, I'd stand out on the Melbourne Road and hitchhike down to Geelong. So I would train absolutely knackered from the going down there. My father would pick me up because he lived not far from the ground in Geelong. I would have dinner with Mum and Dad. They would drive me out to Corio, pitch black, about 9:30, where I'd hitchhike back to Melbourne. Good luck, because I had no other way of getting back.
I'd met Gareth through competing in competition at school. It was a very good basis to a relationship. Whilst I had my issues with Essendon, he had his issues with Geelong, and so we were both ripe for a discussion about, well, how are we going to take this further?
We both were really emotionally, passionately reckoned it was ready to do something. Let's start doing it.
I think we both had some philosophical views about what we saw as equitable.
I think we talked about everything.
The first thing it is, well, my club, with my management, they did this, you know. Oh, you found that problem too, did you? Yes. And so if we're going to actually address that, you don't do that as an individual, because our issues are not just ours, they're for all those other players.
Unionisation of players in footy, we weren't the first to do it, but we didn't want to go down before we were strong. We started to ring around our friends from other clubs to find out then what their thoughts were on this and what it would look like. And it's through those phone calls that led to bringing in the first group of players into our first meeting.
It was a pretty basic organisation when we first started. I think membership fees were $5 and you got a T-shirt. Well, we were talking about pretty basic things. It was at 159 Park Drive, Parkville. I think the Geelong boys used to have a 3 or 4 can trip on the way up, so they were ready to roll when they got there. The sort of stuff we were talking about, was, as I said, it was basic, with things like car parking and creche for the wives and girlfriends, all those sort of basic things. But then we got into the more media stuff, which was, you know, player contracts, injury payments and things of that nature.
We started off calling it a union, and we realised that union wasn't going to be a really good word to use, because the supporters would just go to ground. They didn't want a part of that. But during those early days, we had an association with Bob Hawke.
He was pretty militant, Hawke. He was taking on the establishment back then. He didn't stand for any shit when it came to being interviewed. He was certainly causing problems within the in the Melbourne society, the union, against the establishment. He really didn't light us to what we could actually do.
So we knew that the players were still respected, and right from the word go, I think the players wanted to be heard.
We had to communicate with members, so what we needed to do was have a journal, and The Footballer, as it was called, was that journal. And it was printed by a company in Richmond by a bloke called Ivan Eugene from Industrial Printing and Publicity Co. And he did it all for free.
And more players were getting involved, and meetings were getting bigger. It had its own momentum going forward.
Its relationship with the Victorian Football League was, if you like, cordial and friendly, but nothing much was happening. The VFL decided not to take them on. They don't look as if they're very strong and effective. We'll just let them, for want of a better phrase, stew in their own juices. They didn't actually even have a permanent office for a long period. And to the extent they had staff, it was one person, part-time, and the VFL could basically do what it wanted.
It was frustrating because you'd go up there and they would pretend they were listening, but then there would be nothing coming back as far as benefits were concerned.
The VFL didn't really need to worry about the Players Association. They made a calculation that it was a relatively ineffective organisation. They could easily fob it off when issues came up. On a couple of occasions they thought, well, you know, why should we even bother doing that? And so they threatened to withdraw recognition. And so there was threatened strike action.
Anyone who's been to the Victorian capital knows that football is not a sport here, it's a religion. Worshippers pack their brolly, thermos flask and thick coats to pay homage to and yell obscenities at these gladiators in the skin-tight shorts.
Chance for one.
I was lucky enough to be voted President of the Players in 1980 after a couple of years serving as Treasurer. And the first year I was involved was really became quite a crux for the Players Association. We went up there at the end of the year in 1980 to discuss some player payments under what was called Rule 11. Rule 11 became very insignificant because when we went up to meet with the VFL, they said that the VFL directors and presidents weren't going to meet us with us that particular day, that they'd organised a meeting for us to come up. They no longer recognised the Players Association and that any future dealings would be negotiated without the Players Association's input. So they just basically told us to go and get stuffed.
Jack, originally you had planned to meet the players last night. Why was it that they were kept waiting and then eventually told they would not be met?
Well, that actually was the decision of the meeting. The decision was made by the 12 directors of the league and the presidents of the league. They believe that it should be a player and club relationship.
Well, Jack, how now does the league recognise the Players Association?
Well, we don't recognise the Players Association as a negotiating body.
We went away and spoke to the players and we were in a very fortunate position. This was in December and coming up in March was going to be the night series, which they call the Escort Championship Series. The first match coming up was Essendon versus Fitzroy. So we knew we had a very strong hand in whether that game was going to take place. From my point of view, I thought that was really the turning point in the association. It not only showed the VFL how strong we were, it also showed the other teams in the VFL that weren't as supportive in the Players Association, hey, the association has got a bit of bite now.
Oh, the post is broken. Matthews hit it and broke the point post. Oh, talk about a he-man.
Lee Matthews. I was in the game when he ran into the goalpost at Essendon.
How was that? He split it right down in half.
I reckon that was the rotten one. I reckon it wasn't that hard to break that one, but we better not mess up the story.
Yeah, Lee wasn't a great supporter of the Players Association. He was always going to be really well looked after. So he saw things from a different pair of glasses than most of the other average type of players. I remember Lee was particularly anti the Players Association trying to get extra money for playing on a Sunday. Why should I worry about the others when I'm okay?
Well, the proposal is that on the first 2 weeks of finals that the games are played on Saturday and Sunday. That way, all of those people wanting to see VFL matches would be able to do so.
Well, the meeting has just split up and the VFL has decided unanimously to apply for permits for Sunday football. At this stage, few details are known, but we do know that finals will be included in the application.
The basic principle that the players are trying to get across in this situation is that they want their point of view taken in the way of the running of football. And the way that the VFL has been dictating to players previously, the players just aren't really happy with.
The evolution of the thought of Sunday football was very interesting from the VFL's point of view because they saw it a way of getting a lot more revenue for the VFL because there was going to be a lot more funds and people that would be able to go. So because the first mooted game on a Sunday was going to involve Collingwood and Richmond, Peter Moore being the Vice President of the Players Association at the time, he was negotiating with Collingwood to get extra funds for those players. So that became, if you like, the benchmark for what players were going to get paid extra for playing on a Sunday.
I can remember having discussions about we're going to play our first game of football on a Sunday. It happened to be Essendon and Collingwood. And I didn't think any player would actually not play. But I said, look, I'm not sure if the players would actually play for this game. I'm not sure if they're going to do it. Now, I never said they wouldn't, but I never said they would. But you always plant the seed and said, I'm not sure all the players are prepared for this. I'm not sure all the players are going to play. The threat of action can sometimes be as powerful as the action itself. I actually received a brown paper bag of cash on the Thursday from a supporter because I said to our president, he said, what do the players want? I think I said we want an extra $200 each to play on Sunday. And he said, all right, OK, we'll get you. He said, so what about $100 each cash and $100 into the player trip fund? I went, well, I think I can take that to players. So we played, Collingwood played, and apparently Collingwood had no extra money.
The VFL has done the unthinkable and allowed 2 more teams into the competition, the Brisbane Bears and the West Coast Eagles. There has been and there still is opposition to that bold move, but Ross Oakley, the new VFL Commissioner, is positive it's the right one.
The realists amongst the supporters and the people in the clubs realise that it just had to be done, and they're looking forward to it with a great deal of excitement.
Well, when I arrived at the VFL, things were in a pretty poor state. The league had a $40 million debt, and that was like a noose around their neck. More than half the clubs were technically bankrupt, and we were in real trouble. We were in survival mode. We just kicked off a national competition. We actually charged each of the clubs $4 million for a licence fee because that was the only way we were going to get that decision through the VFL board. But we got to the Players Association, I think early '88. They asked for a meeting with the Commission, and the Commission said, look, you can meet with them, but don't engage with them. We didn't want the Players Association coming to us and putting pay demands on us.
Big objectives for the Players Association in the late 80s was serious representation against the serious development of the game professionally. There was had to be a real match of that. You had to understand that this is getting serious and we need to have serious representation. Serious representation. They had a get-together at one of the hotels in town and Dermot Brereton's turning up. And that, that level of players turning up. And all of a sudden the league's going, oh, hang on, this is all the players. And it's the stars as well. And that's when they started to say, well, they have to take notice. So you get the standard playing contract on the table as the first negotiating tool, and then you get the stars turning up and going, yeah, we're in on this because we're teammates. And all of a sudden you start to go, yeah, this is snowballing into what it should be.
It wasn't until 1990 when we changed the name to the AFL and the Players Association changed their name to the AFL Players Association that we actually provided them what they call a collective bargaining agreement. It was the first hesitant step at putting an agreement with the players together.
The deed of agreement basically it was a mechanism very much for the AFL to control the clubs and the players.
The Commission says by scrapping the standard contract, players will be assisted in working out terms with their clubs that better meet their needs.
The standard player contract the association has seen, I suppose, in some respects as an impediment to players determining what their own arrangements should be. The standard player contract seemed to be a bit of a sticking point with the players. They wanted a bit of freedom to be able to go and negotiate their own. They didn't want all these contract clauses in there that were restricting things. So we pulled the standard player contract and the players decided to have that meeting at the Radisson and threatened strike action.
We put the word out, but you could never be sure how many players might turn up. It was in pre-season, it was midweek, so you're just never quite sure what you might get. And we had a fantastic turnout. We had turnout from representatives from all the clubs. The big name players themselves were the ones who suggested it. They said, look, we don't want to lose this opportunity. Let's make a statement at the end of the night and we will stand up behind myself and show that we're endorsing the position of the Players Association. But the great thing about that image is the big name players are standing behind me. I think it turned up on the front page of the daily papers the next day, and there was no way that the league could deny they had a situation.
That did put us under pressure. That meeting, we said, wow, the players are fair dinkum. They're talking potential strike.
Clearly they are trying to establish a position for themselves. And we really don't believe that is appropriate in today's climate.
The more they are antagonistic towards the association, the more they reaffirm in the players' minds that they should have one.
But there's no doubt that that meeting was a catalyst for the collective bargaining agreement. We were able to give them quite a few of the benefits that they'd been looking for.
It was this round 4 clash between Essendon's Michael Long and Collingwood's Damien Monkhorst that sparked the latest racism controversy.
The great success will be if we don't hear anything more about it.
Any constructive move to up the ante, to stamp out racism in sport, deserves to be encouraged.
We didn't see that it was something that the Players Association could really do a lot for us with.
The AFL likes to control things. I think they weren't necessarily on board with our calling out of racism.
He's one of the most decorated players in the game's history, but Adam Goodes now ranks as the game's most polarising figure. The boos have grown in volume since Goodes produced his war dance during Indigenous Round 2 months ago.
It's a war cry. It's to any Carlton player, supporter, saying this is who I am, this is what I'm representing.
I just remember when all the Goodesy stuff was happening, it was just like, what is going on? Am I missing something? Where is everyone? It felt like the only people who were standing up for Goodsy were the Players Association and by proxy the players and the Sydney Swans.
Outside the SCG, jumpers were handed out bearing the Stars number 37. Fans adamant the constant booing of the former Australian of the Year is nothing but racist bullying.
The only voice of reason was coming from the PA's head office.
The Players Association has met to discuss an on-field response.
We've got a player here that has stood up against racism in this country, and from where we sit, he's being vilified for doing so, and it's not good enough. It's shameful. I'm embarrassed to be an Australian right at the moment.
We organised every 2 years Indigenous camps. There's one in Alice Springs. There was one in Broome.
Oh man, the camps were awesome. Those bonds that you'd make would then create a very tangible support network for players beyond their football club, players that understood similar issues, like that's what you want when you're going through something. You want to lean on people who have been there, who have walked that road before. The Indigenous Advisory Board was elected by the Indigenous playing group. So straight away, you've got your elected representatives who you want to be making recommendations on your behalf, which you can then take to Clubland or to AFL House. And then when an issue comes up, how do we want to best solve it? Well, we've got our elected minds in a room, get them on a call and get their counsel. It then means that the Players Association can truly say we have this tangible voice from our Indigenous playing cohort which reflects what they want.
Former North Melbourne and Hawthorn player Andrew Demetriou was today appointed Chief Executive of the AFL Players Association.
I like working with people, and I have no doubt that we can certainly work with everyone associated with the Players Association.
Andrew is a big picture thinker.
He was a big picture guy. Now, the thing about Andrew is he knows how to get things done.
You know, my wife used to say that the reason I had arms was so I could talk to Andrew on the phone.
Very much sky's the limit, which was a good thing because he probably lifted the horizons as far as the Players Association go, and he really did have the benefit of the big picture thinking, Andrew.
Well, to be honest, I think they were a bit lost. They wanted to reinvent themselves, revitalise the PA, get full membership, and I wanted to try and shift the dial to say, if we work collaboratively with the AFL and in partnership, I'm sure we can get the outcomes we wanted. So what we did, I organised a survey of about 65 questions, took 45 pencils to every club, met with them all and said, you're not leaving the room till you fill in this survey. And some key things came out of that which set us on our path. I expected things like more pay, greater share of the income revenue to go to the players. But the players wanted, one, to have respect for their work-life balance, so we organised a day off for them a week. Secondly, they wanted an education and training fund, because they wanted to be able to study while they played or even do some job training. And thirdly, they wanted to be looked after post their career, and so we set up a retirement fund.
91% of players are concerned about their welfare and life after football. 99% now think financial planning is important.
So I went to the AFL with these results and said, look, these are really important things to the players. We want a fair share of the pie. We don't think we're getting a fair share, so we organised subsequently a very significant pay increase, but more importantly, the players sacrificed some of that pay increase to put money into the retirement fund, put money into education and training grants, and to fund the AFLPA operation, which at the time had no funding.
He turned the AFL Players Association around. The AFL, they changed. They recognised a Players Association fitted in with their long-term goals of growing the sport.
I mean, that was the key, because as an employee association / union, you can only be effective if you're legitimate, and you can only be legitimate if you're representative, and I mean truly representative. And for years we weren't. Once we delivered some really meaningful, important outcomes, I guess then you could lift your sights about other things, I guess particularly around labour market reform as well.
At a Melbourne Press Club luncheon, Elliott continued his long-running distaste for the AFL. The collective bargaining agreement came under fire. Elliott says clubs are getting poorer while players get richer.
I do think they can do everything better.
Average payments doubled in the last 5 years, from $70,000 to $140,000.
If we want better sort of outcomes for players in terms and conditions, there's got to be a price to pay.
Well, the PA got itself together. I think we conducted a sort of internal review to become more representative, and there's a conflation set of events which meant that the AFL was really willing to sit down and regard the PA as a legitimate stakeholder. So there was a significant CBA which Andrew delivered. It was well supported by an increasingly focused and representative Players Association at a time when the AFL was willing to sort of open the door and give the PA a seat at the table.
The game was shifting very much towards full-time commitments, and there was a growing awareness of the need to make sure that players were going to be able to transition out of the game.
The transition piece out of the game is something that world sport doesn't do well.
I think at the time, the stat was a lot of careers finished after 4 years, and, there's a big commitment to be made in that period, a lot of things sacrificed. So if you're asking young men to pursue their AFL career at the expense of other things, you need to be able to provide ways in which they can pick up on that post-football career.
Well, I think the PA has been terrific in the way that it's provided support for former players, particularly in the area of medical subsidies. I think a lot of past players perhaps aren't fully aware of the sort of support that the Players Association does give.
We brought the player development program in-house because the principle was right. It was just, we had to make this. And once again, I guess it increased our legitimacy as an organisation.
The game has We also played a big role in promoting the role of player development managers within clubs. The Players Association actually, played a big role in educating and developing the people in those roles, because ultimately that was to the benefit of the players. The education and training grants, they were a really significant contribution. When we did a survey of those players that were studying prior to the grants, it was under 100 players studying. And then when the grants came in and the player take-up was measured, there was well over 400 who'd gone into the tertiary sector or TAFE, or whatever the case may be.
The end-of-season player-voted MVP award is to get a name. The AFL Players Association today honoured Lee Matthews, naming its MVP award in honour of the great man.
The AFL PA obviously had the MVP award, had been around for a few years, and you go through the list of names that win it, and it's the greats of the game. And I just felt like there was an opportunity to elevate the status and the public's awareness of the MVP. Part of that was MVP is kind of an American term. The players voted quite strongly to call it the Matthews Trophy.
Matthews, like Houdini, look at him. A snap, a great snap. What a goal!
I'd much rather have Lee on my side than on the opposition side.
He was a fierce competitor, a terrific player. If you can change the course of the game by your own play, you're a very unique player, and Matthews was one of those.
I remember one of my better games, I had 30 and kicked 5 goals. I've only ever done it once in my career. And I had a post-match interview with Matthew Richardson and the team at 7 upstairs. And they're having a bit of a chuckle when I got on there. And Richo said, "Paddy, well done. You've had an incredible game. You're 30 and kicked 5. You've just got to do it 11 more times to catch Lee now." And you could hear Lee chuckling up in the corner.
Well, you could argue that it was a sliding door moment for me, because I finished in 85, so 82. I mean, I had a lot of years, I guess, where in the various awards I was in contention, and 82 was probably the last year where I would have been in contention for an award like this. And it happened to be the inaugural one for the Players Association.
To be recognised by your peers, I don't think there's anything more special than that.
I remember Rod Newt invited me to spend a week with the Western Bulldogs. I went to a couple of meetings, just the language and the game plan, the way it was being coached and developed, and player management had changed so much in 4 or 5 years. I think when I was a footballer, we were just steak and eggs footballers. We just played footy and that was it. But I reckon there'd been almost a celebrification. Footballers were becoming increasingly entertainers. Disposable income was increasing, which was great, but led to risks. So the transition from the game out of the game and the risks involved with that were becoming more acute. And there was, for the first time, there was the issue of sort of illicit drugs. There was a player who was pronounced clinically dead.
The AFL is both protective and proud of its illicit drugs code, maintaining it to be the most stringent in Australian sport.
I remember that coming into the system around 2005, 2006, and it's been such a step change and controversial in many ways for some people. But at its core, it was looking after the players. I think with some of the powerful voices in the PA at the time and some of the influential people within the game, it's great to see that just because a number of those players were pretty good at what they did, they were lending themselves to helping the broader collective.
I think it's been a success in reducing dramatically the number of players taking illicit drugs and in providing help and changing the behaviour of those players.
It's still controversial. Drugs polarise. Drugs are in our society. But I think it's been a really important and meaningful measure.
The best players in the competition generally were doing something very active off the field, and that was a springboard to allow us to keep pushing and driving for more for the players.
Think back to the 2011 CBA. There were some pretty tense moments in that negotiation. Andrew was leading the AFL. He'd been a CEO of the PA before that, so he had a great understanding for our role and the way we went about it. But he also had a really strong vision for the game, and that involved expansion, introducing 2 new teams, which was going to cost a lot of money. So I think inevitably that tension arose in terms of how do you allocate the resource, how do you reward the players for the role they were playing in creating the rude health of the game.
It's rapidly turned into a fierce tug of war, and today the AFL outlined details of its final offer.
The AFL has offered $1.1 billion for the next 5 years, but the Players Association says it's wanting $1.3 billion because once wages for the two new teams are taken into account, players could actually get a pay cut.
So we had our moments, in those negotiations, and at one stage we had a mass meeting of the players all coming together at Crown Casino.
It was a watershed moment to get everyone in the room and dialed in at the same time. Because at the time, the narrative is pushed very hard from the AFL that the players are being greedy, there's not enough money in the game, what about grassroots footy? Obviously, the players will start at grassroots, and we want to make sure that that longevity is there for our sons, our daughters, and the community going forward. But by the way, we're the ones out there doing the job, so maybe we need to swing the narrative back our way.
We want a fair negotiation, and we want a good outcome.
And that's what that purpose was for.
Didn't faze us much. I think the internal chats went more along the lines of, they'll do what they do, we get it, it's posturing. I think we're on solid ground. I don't think you're going to win the public over doing that sort of thing. The public thinks you're overpaid as it is.
With the two parties poles apart, the threat of industrial action forever hovering.
Yeah, I don't think we're ever going to down tools, but there was talk of that. I think we were advised at the time to keep that on the table because, that might have been the, golden chip that we had.
Yeah, I think Andrew, could sense a bit of theatrics, I suppose, in terms of what that meeting represented. But it was also about the players seeing the importance of coming together. And if you're going to rely upon their unity, sometimes you've got to teach the players about the power of their unity as well.
There's no one better than the shop floor to talk to about, what pressures they're feeling or what the schedule should look like.
Finally, a breakthrough. The AFL had been adamant there was no more money, and they were true to their word, the deal worth more than $1.1 billion.
Not one player wasn't happy to be able to go back to their club and to their players and tell them we'd reached a deal.
They had a group of players who were absolutely united in what they were determined to do, and when you get that combination, it makes for good, robust dialogue.
Without the advocacy of the players from the PA, all of that welfare, player development wouldn't have come. The players were so verbal and strong in their opinions on that. Eventually, they banged down the door of the AFL and the clubs to get that across the line.
In Victoria, a revolution is underway. The North Melbourne Football Club has won its first premiership. In 3 seasons, North had gone from last to premiers in perhaps the most controversial turnaround in league history. Their secret, a short-lived innovation called the 10-year rule.
The AFL introduced a 10-year rule so that players after 10 years could go to another club. Now, North Melbourne took advantage of that in '74, and they got Barry Davis, Doug Wade, John Rantel, and then they got this guy called Ron Barassi to coach them.
And you probably don't even know what I'm talking about, do you?
And then, their famous premiership in 1977.
I'll be in this, I'll be right in this!
Now, the players liked it because after 10 years they could escape. The 10-year rule upset clubs. So the VFL said, well, we're going to rescind it. And the players said, no, you can't. And they did it anyway.
Having waved goodbye to Hawthorn, Swans fans quickly jumped on the Buddy bandwagon. The massive 9-year, $10 million agreement, a chance to win more silverware.
There was a bit of a fear that the sky might fall in if free agency was introduced, and I think it was really when the labour market and the player movement was actually trickling to not much at all. And that was undermining, the system of competitive balance that the game relied upon.
I'd been through a situation where free agency wasn't around in 2009, and it made that whole process of trying to move clubs and rejuvenate a career really challenging.
There's 800 or 900 players and 20 or 30 players move at the end of every year. It just didn't seem congruent with what other sporting bodies do, but just life in general.
And there was always going to be debate around when's the right time, and might not be fair for some clubs compared to others. But I think, broadly speaking, it's been a really good thing that's come into the game.
some sort of collective, systematic form of substance abuse took place at Essendon.
Football is just simply never going to be the same again.
I think that the Essendon saga was challenging because you didn't have a completely unified playing group. You know, not every other player at every other team had enormous empathy and sympathy for that in the initial stages.
Our responsibility was wrapping our arms around the Essendon players and understanding what had taken place, helping them in any way we could.
The impact this had on those players and their families can never be understated. I think they, in my view, were treated terribly. Some other teams saw that Essendon had an advantage here. But our view of this is, look, this could have happened to you. And I always felt like this wasn't going to end well for them.
Our role was to be able to provide the players with some genuinely independent advice and support that they could receive to navigate the myriad of issues that were throwing up.
We had a dedicated team of lawyers working on this day in, day out. We were going out to Essendon every week to meet with the players, to give them updates. But this was a big political issue, and the fact that it looked the way that it looked, to me, it always smelt like it was going to, head in the direction that it ended up.
The last 2 years have been extremely difficult for us and our families.
I remember giving Joe Watson a call just to say, we're here for you. Don't know what that looks like, not sure what that'll mean, but we are here for you and lean on us to assist.
Today I am releasing the findings of a 12-month investigation by the Australian Crime Commission. The findings are shocking and they'll disgust Australian sports fans.
We are struggling to understand how the CAS decision can be so different to that of the AFL Anti-Doping Tribunal.
Watson's now disputed Brownlow medal continues to generate debate, but it's clear Joe Watson is a broken man.
You know, to watch that many grown men in tears was pretty heartbreaking.
Putting yourself in the situation that these guys were left very vulnerable in, it was quite easy to put your arms around them and support them. And that is the role of the PA.
Darcy Vesio with 4 goals.
Was that beyond your wildest dreams?
Oh, that was insane. Just the numbers, the crowd, the game was so fast and the girls did so well. We're really happy with that.
I suppose it was just a wild sort of time. My first thoughts is that I just knew nothing about the AFL world in general.
Our view was we're the AFL Players Association and, that's not gender specific and we need to make sure that we're representing both groups.
I think it was Paul Marsh who said, what should you be paid? And we all just looked blankly at each other and thought, how on earth would we know? We've been paying nearly $400 a year just to play football.
They were strapping their own ankles, they were bringing their own ice bars to training. There was a lack of facilities for the women.
Female athletes have different needs to male athletes as well. I think some of our problems in unifying the players early on was treating the W players the same way we treat the men. 2019, the AFL wanted to do a 3-year deal. We thought the 3-year deal made a bit of sense because one of the issues is just annual uncertainty. We hadn't taken the players along that journey as well as what we needed to, and so some of this absolutely lays with us.
Obviously, I was part of a pretty vocal group that felt like we weren't really part of that process, and what sort of played out publicly was a bit unfortunate. Before that, we'd always been one big playing group, and it really felt like we were sort of split in a lot of ways, which did create a bit of fire.
I think at the end of the day, all of us essentially wanted the same thing, but it was probably on a different timeline and in a different manner. So it caused some headaches and a couple of rush flights to Melbourne to get us all in a room and try and sort things out.
I think we've been able to turn things around significantly with the W group, and we're in a much better place.
I'm really pleased for the players now in the conditions and particularly the pay that they're seeing.
45 years earlier, the men were fighting for the bare minimums of pay and boots and various kind of things that maybe the general public think are just of course they're getting all this stuff. Well, no, there's a body, and that's the PA that fights for the players' rights on this stuff.
Often, what gets thrown back at us and the W players is, be patient. The men took a long time to get there, but the relativity is, we don't need to wait 50 years for the W players to get where we need to get to. What we need is an industry with a vision. The women's sport is actually on a significant growth curve, and we should be at the top of that.
The AFL industry is facing its biggest financial crisis in our history. This is just unprecedented for all businesses, for our communities, for Australians.
I remember getting a call from Gil the morning of the season launch that year, and he said, "We are in real trouble here. I've had a briefing from the government, and our season is looking in real risk here."
We were brought in as a club and basically told, "You're heading home. We don't know when you'll be back. Staff are let off. There is no money at Clubland."
Today's AFLW semi-final between Carlton and Brisbane Lions, with the last NAB AFL women's match to be played, with the 2020 season ending today.
It was mayhem. We all grabbed our phones from the suitcase that you have to put them in when you play, and we had this email from the Players Association and the AFL saying the season was done. Then it was kind of like, all right, everyone regroup, and what's next?
We then just moved into, communicate. That was our first thing. We need to get the information. We need to communicate to the players. They were stressed. The uncertainty around it was significant. Because at the start, this was much more about, our players, as their health at risk.
For us as players, because of the way that broadcast is paid to the league, it's, I think, fortnightly, and that's dependent on games being played. When there is no games being played, then there is no money to go around, and you've got 800-900 players to appease.
But obviously players were panicking about their careers. I reckon we would have done a couple of hundred Zoom calls that year. I mean, it was ridiculous. Maybe we over-communicated, but at the same time, we'd taken a position early on that we are going to make sure the players have their questions answered. I've heard players talk about this publicly, but also privately. They felt like we were the only ones giving them the actual honest information around what was going on here, and we got smacked for that at times.
I remember the biggest thing that we had support with as players was employment, because everyone knew that that was the hardest battle for everyone in life, not just sports people. And so I think most of the PA's support was in the psych services, but then also through our PDMs and our welfare people trying everything they could to make sure that players had work.
The game gets put on hold. We do a deal with the AFL for the players' pay, and the players are going to get 50% of their pay even if they don't play a game for the year, which was hard fought and done very quickly, and they'll get 70% of their pay if the season goes ahead. So we had this period where, okay, we're hoping to play 17 games, and then as that date is drawing closer, we're thinking, okay, how are we going to do this? And so the conversation with the AFL is, we're probably not going to be able to play these, home and away like we'd normally do. Hubs is where this is headed. Players understandably blew up. I found out about the chat facility on Zoom calls that night, because I remember giving them that information and it went berserk. I mean, there were hundreds of comments from the players, not one of them positive. Inevitably that leaks into the media the next day, and Eddie's on there saying that we've panicked the players, we've spooked the families, and it's not true. And I think he even referred to, this is really serious. This is not the conversation that's happening at the adults table.
I actually feel really angry that so many of the players have been G'd up. Their partners who are already under stress have been further stressed in that situation.
G'd up by who?
Well, G'd up by the meeting last night. What was put to them by Paul Marsh quite clearly.
Obviously, I fired back and said you'd like to think the players would be at the adults table, but that was the information we were getting, so I'm not sure if he wasn't getting it at the adults table, but we were certainly getting that information in writing from the AFL. So it was just 24/7. That's by far the most difficult thing that I've ever had to deal with from a work perspective, but also something that I'm incredibly proud of, the work that we did to get through that. I don't think the players will ever really know how much we did for them during that time.
I think the investment that players made throughout the 2020 season was significant in keeping the game afloat. Without the work that those players did throughout that time, then we wouldn't be in the strong financial position that we find ourselves as a code.
I'm going to talk about the joint CBA. There's been a bit of discussion amongst players around why we're doing a joint CBA. There's about 1,400 male and female players now.
The collective bargaining agreement, it's essentially our agreement with players with the league, and then intertwined through that is media and broadcast and their requirements. So there's a lot of money in the pot for us as players, it's getting a fair share of that.
We're right in the thick of this at the moment. It's a really important time for the PA, but it's a really important time for the playing group as well as we work through this. So the deal that we did back in 2017 was the first time that the AFL PA had got a revenue share model in place for the playing group.
The board made it very clear to me that they wanted a significant outcome from the next collective bargaining agreement. They'd been fighting for a revenue share model. It's a model that pays the players on the actual revenues of the industry. And the way that I'm built is there's still more to do. And so we're not sitting here thumping our chest saying we've done it all. But, this is hard. Like, you're one out against the industry. It's David and Goliath in many respects. And we get there because our players care, our staff are amazing. And so I'm really proud. Like, none of this stuff has been easy, yet I think we punch well above our weight, and that's through passion and really caring about the future of our players, but also the game.
The questions that we get asked the most by the players, one of them is, when's it going to get done? It'll get done when it's the right deal for you, and we'll keep holding on until we get the right deal in place.
I think the AFLPA has done an amazing job. Occasionally I can get a bit emotional about that because when you think about the challenges that are before them, I think the AFLPA has led in seeing footballers as people.
The whole world of footy has changed, but respectfully I think it's changed a lot for the better, and for the Players Association to be a major part of that, I feel pretty warm in the heart about it.
If you look at the future of football, my view is that you've got to have the AFLPA as a decision maker in the AFL Commission. We didn't have a Players Association at this time. 50 years on, we do. It's experienced, it's knowledgeable, it's resourced, and so they are, I think, really crucial to the success of football, and therefore they should be part of the decision-making of the AFL.
The needs of players have changed over 50 years, from what boots you could wear, paying for shorts and socks, versus what they are now. But in many ways, a lot of the challenges are still there. That part isn't lost on me. It's certainly something that I don't take lightly. It's been an absolute privilege and an honour to be involved in the PA for the time that I've been here for.